Details. I'm Casey Schuyler, the editor of the Times-Union, and welcome to Moving General Schuyler, a discussion on the issues surrounding the decision to move the statue of Major General Philip Schuyler from in front of Albany City Hall. Very quickly, some context on what we're discussing. This all emerges from the decision which was announced on June 11th by Mayor Kathy Sheehan to move the statue that had been in place since 1925 from its current location in front of City Hall. The mayor, in explaining the move, cited complaints that it was inappropriate for a statue of someone who did own enslaved persons for decades to stand so close to the seat of city government, especially in a city as diverse as Albany. The past months since the decision was announced have brought debate that has pitted racial justice against the veneration of a man who undoubtedly played a key role in the nation's founding, played a pivotal role in the American Revolution, and held a number of elected offices at the city and state level. It has been indeed a reckoning with local history, as people have once again been forced anew or faced anew with the knowledge that the legacy of slavery is wound around our community. And it is a story as old as that of Albany itself, in the names of streets and schools and, of course, statues. And with that, I would like to welcome our esteemed panel, beginning with Dr. Alice Green, Executive Director of Albany's Center for Law and Justice, which this year marks its 35th year of operation. Dr. Oscar Williams, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at the University at Albany. Dr. Williams is the author of George Schuyler, Portrait of a Black Conservative. Harold Holzer, Director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. Harold served more than 2 decades as Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is the author most recently of The Presidents versus the Press. And when I say most recently, I mean this week. And Avery Schuyler-Dey, one of the descendants of General Schuyler. She is a student of English and history at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where she joins us from today. She has in recent months spoken on her family's behalf. And last, but certainly not least, Mayor Kathy Sheehan, now in her 2nd term and 6th year in office. So thank you all very much for taking part in what I'm sure will be a substantive discussion. And I wanted to start off by asking the mayor to speak to the context in which the decision was made as the city was embroiled in the protests that followed the killing of George Floyd of Minneapolis. And also, if you could tell us, what is the current status of the removal process? Is the city closing in on a destination for the statue?
Thank you, Casey, and it is an honor to be here with these esteemed panelists. I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have. And, you know, as we will can all recall, you know, back on June 11th, temperatures were very high in the city of Albany and across the country. And, you know, the Schuyler statue was a topic of discussion that I had been having with our chief diversity officer for more than a year. You know, she had shared with me her personal feelings about the statue and feelings that employees had come to her with respect to the fact that this person was a slaveholder and what he represented to, you know, really nearly half of our workforce. So, you know, we were having that conversation and talking about how we would engage in a community dialogue around the statue and what, if anything, to do with it. And then, of course, the George Floyd was murdered in front of all of our eyes. And what was something that was intended to be a longer community conversation became something that was very urgent. There were very credible threats of people coming to deface or try to tear down the statue. And I had a number of employees come to me personally to talk about how unwelcome they felt when they had to walk past that statue to get into City Hall every day. And so I made the decision, I issued the executive order, and we are now assembling a group of residents from diverse backgrounds in the city to talk about where the statue should go. This is not about taking something away and destroying it. It's about putting it in a place where the history can be contextualized. I love Schuyler Mansion. I love going there. I love learning the history. And there is a way to contextualize that history, the entire story, when you immerse yourself in it. And that's something that I don't think can happen at a traffic circle.
With that in mind, I would like to turn to Harold Holzer, because he does have to jump off in a little bit. And it seems like a perfect segue to talk about the issue of recontextualization. You, of course, come to it from your experience at the Met, but you're also familiar with the debate over monuments in public spaces. How does, can you speak to sort of how the process works and the circumstances where it might not be an appropriate remedy where it involves leaving a monument in its current place?
Well, I admit that I've evolved myself on this issue, this emotional issue. I spoke at Gettysburg a few years ago and suggested that we shouldn't immediately choose iconoclasm as our solution for the discomfort that we indeed feel and should feel in the face of some of these statues that have aesthetic value as works of art. I've come to regret that I said that, or at least change my view. I now believe that statues of Confederate leaders, and there are some beautiful ones. I mean, just the Mercier statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond may be the best equestrian statue in the country, next to New York City's own George Washington, or one of the best. But too many people have been pained walking in its shadow. It sits in civic space, as the mayor said, that demonstrates acceptance of the person's activities. But I do worry that extending this judgment to people whose main focus in life was not fighting for separation and disunion and the perpetuation of slavery as active traitors to the United States takes us down a kind of a slippery slope. There is no perfection in American history, to be sure. All of these characters were flawed in some way. I'm not saying that the ownership of slaves was not a giant flaw, but slavery did not end as an institution in New York State until anywhere between 1791 and 1804. And I worry that we're going to find reasons to remove every monument in the country if we apply a 21st century filter and litmus test to 18th century figures, or even 19th century. But by the way, I'm a great admirer of Mayor Sheehan. I've been a fan of hers for years. But what about the Philip Sheridan statue, the back of which Governor Cuomo has to look at every day in front of the state capitol? Sheridan, on the one hand, helped win the war. He did almost as much as William Sherman to end the Civil War in 1864-65. But his later racism, particularly expressed against Native Americans, was horrendous. Where do we put him in our pantheon? Is he to be condemned because of his incredible statements and atrocities against Native peoples, or celebrated for helping to end slavery? Do we have to put some context on that statue? And is there a way to add context to Schuyler? To remind everyone, he was a leader in the fight for the independence and the Constitution, flawed as that document was, and also was wealthy enough, like most wealthy New Yorkers of the time, to own human beings. So I'm concerned, and I'm not convinced that removing him is the right way. And I'd love to know where he winds up. That is crucial.
Alice Green, was the knowledge of Schuyler's legacy as a slaveholder well known within the Black community in Albany? Was the presence of the statue as a potentially offensive symbol well known, or a topic of ongoing conversation?
Well, first of all, I want to note that Blacks are not monolithic, so a group of people. So there are different views expressed in the community But I talked to many Blacks in the community about the issue of removing the statue, and a number even contacted me to express their feelings and their attitudes. And most were not previously aware of who Schuyler was. They knew that he was an historical figure because buildings and streets were named after him, but few were aware of his role as enslaver of Black people. And once they learned of it, most agreed with the mayor's decision to remove the statue from public property, which I too strongly agree with. But in our conversations that I had with Blacks on this issue, they had expressed great disgust and anger about the whole George Floyd thing. And as more attention was focused on, the monuments that were honoring Southern Civil War heroes and enslavers, the tension sort of rose around this issue. But I must say that some of the people I spoke to came to recognize and respect the contributions that General Schuyler made in Albany, but they also recognized that his accomplishments had little or nothing to do with furthering the freedom and equity of Black people. I mean, both someone just mentioned the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War. They were steeped obviously in democratic principles of freedom and justice, but only for white people. So recognition and support was also given to the current Black Lives Movement, and it's a vibrant movement for change, and the movement is strongly devoted to dismantling white supremacy and structural racism, wherever we as Black people find it, whether it's in the past, in the present, or in the future. And so we strongly proclaim the equal value of all Black lives. So what I got from it, from talking to people, everyone viewed, including me, Philip Schuyler as a white supremacist. And that's evidenced by his enslavement and devaluation of Black lives. He stole their labor, profited from it, and handed it down to his descendants. And Blacks received nothing to hand down to their descendants, but the oppression and harm that we continue to bear in 2020 in the city, the state, and the nation. So it's important that white people recognize that enslavement was not a benign and harmless event that ended in 1865. So we continue to suffer the effects of what Schuyler was involved in and others who had enslaved us, and white supremacy. We're still dealing with issues around poverty, discrimination, poor health, psychological damage, all of those things that we've been talking about. So we can't forget that. And so honoring and glorifying the deeds of a man who treated Black people as animals, basically, with his bigger than life images on public property, for us is not acceptable. We have a responsibility in our community not to forget the horrifying things that happened to Black people during the period of enslavement. So the community wants us, to remember what that enslavement period was like and what it did and the impact we're still feeling.
That's a strong indictment and a very tough pivot to go to Avery Schuyler-Dey to ask kind of how the general's legacy is sort of understood within the family. The name you bear comes with a great deal of honor, but as Alice Green just laid out, it does come with a certain indictment. And I guess the kind of more immediate question is, how was news of the statue's removal kind of taken within the family?
I don't think that our reaction or our feelings are very relevant to this panel or this discussion. And I think that what we really need to focus on is the future of recontextualizing American history. And as Alice Green said, it's to not forget our past and to not brush what is uncomfortable under the carpet. So I'm very much understanding of her points and in agreement with a lot of her points. As far as the removal of the statue, I worry that taking it down from City Hall and removing it to, as some who have contacted me have suggested, of a graveyard or at the Schuyler Mansion. Not only is that saying to the community that this period in history deserves to be in a graveyard where things are dead and forgotten, or in a museum where we have to then pay for someone to curate that museum, someone to pay for the electricity in that museum, and then charge citizens of Albany a fee, which further makes elite certain parts of our history's complex narrative. So I'm very much in agreement. I don't think how we feel personally bearing the name of the statue is very relevant to moving forward, because I think this is about balancing the narrative and making it better for the future, so that when Alice was saying that a lot of members of the community didn't even know Philip Schuyler, not only his victories, but also his flaws. That's alarming to me. And I think that removing the statue is going to further that not understanding of him as a historical figure. I have a creative solution that I've personally thought of in regard to the statue that maybe we could get to later in the discussion, but yes, that's what I'd like to say.
Well, and so to Oscar Williams, the understanding of slavery, I think in the antebellum South is much better understood. It's much more ingrained in the culture. It's much more ingrained even in high school history classes. Does the North, especially New York to an extent, let itself off the hook a little bit too easily in failing to acknowledge the role that slavery played in its history?
Well, my view of that is, with a number of people, as has already been expressed, a lot of them are not knowledgeable that there was slavery that existed in the North. And actually, I myself wrote an article many years ago talking about the extent of slavery in Albany. As for letting off the hook, I would just simply say that a number of people simply either are not knowledgeable about it, or, as with many people discussing about slavery, are uncomfortable discussing about it. Because obviously, as we see from here, slavery is a very difficult subject to discuss. And really, I think it's a matter of just having forums like this and making people more aware of the extent of slavery in New York.
Is there, and maybe I'll just throw this open to the panel, is there a situation where a statue of someone with a complicated legacy is appropriate, for example, as it's been mentioned, on a battlefield, but not necessarily in front of City Hall, that where that person's kind of heroic actions were at their height is a more appropriate place for a statue to sit? I mean, maybe this goes to, this might go to Avery's suggestion, or perhaps to the mayor, some of the possible locations where the statue might end up.
That could almost be considered a museum in a sense. I mean, the same concept is there at a battlefield. So I wouldn't have any problems with that. It's just that in Albany, it has a very prominent place, and it's a reminder, a constant reminder of what we as African Americans have gone through. And we can't just, add a little, any context to that statue, because I think that it also devalues the lives of Black people. So if we can find a place where it does not offend or harm people every time they go out, to the city to look at and be reminded. Now that they know, as I said before, a lot of people didn't know, but now that they know, it's taken on a new meaning. And because we're so interested in destroying and dismantling white supremacy, I think we have to have those kinds of discussions so that people understand what it all means to have it there.
By the way, on the subject of the battlefield, I'm sorry, Mayor, can I just point out one thing about the battlefield alternative? It's interesting, most of the people who've been discussing Confederate monuments have been saying they ought to remain on Civil War battlefields, particularly if they are sitting on a spot where a particular commander actually launched an action or participated in an action, like Lee near Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. However, the House of Representatives just passed a bill that authorizes, actually not authorizes, but requires the removal of all Confederate monuments from all national parks. Considering where the United States Senate is at the moment, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it was more of a demonstration of a new sensibility. So I'm not sure the battlefields are going to be an alternative. On Avery's very good point, I love, as a guy who worked at a museum for 23 years, I love what you said about museums paying for curation, paying for admission, all that is true. But I also want to point out that there is a basic flaw in the museum alternative. And that is that these sculptures were carved specifically to stand at a certain elevation. So they're carved in kind of cartoonish relief. If you're looking at them head on, they don't work. And museums can't put statues on pedestals within their interiors. They don't generally, unless they have great rotundas or such, they can't accommodate them. So I think we're gonna have to get real about whether we wanna, just put it on the outskirts or battlefield that is not a national park. There are gonna be some tough choices ahead, and they're going to include not only General Sheridan, I predict, but George Washington, Thomas Jefferson in Washington. New York City Hall has a Thomas Jefferson statue. There's a great deal of debate about that. So I just throw that out.
At Gettysburg, the removal of that many statues, that's several hundred tons of marble if you were to do that at Gettysburg.
It's bronze, but absolutely, and a lot of marble too. You're right, both. Yeah, but Gettysburg also has an Alabama monument that was dedicated by George Wallace. I think that's a no-brainer. That shouldn't be on the battlefield. It's not contemporary with the war. It's not even contemporary with the post-war period. It's a celebration of white supremacy 100 years after the war. And I don't know how that kind of procedure ever was allowed to happen 50 years ago.
So I think that that's a good example, though, of sort of why we are where we are, right? When it comes to our monuments, the question is who decides, right? Who decides where monuments are going to go, what they're going to depict? And we have a city that has changed dramatically over the last 100 years. We have a city that is nearly, majority minority. I don't like using the word minority, but majority people of color, Blacks, Latinos, immigrants. And I think when we think about what is going to happen next, we have to have a community conversation around where this statue goes, what it means to us in the context of 2020, what it means in the context of history. And I think it's a cautionary tale for anyone who is looking to create new monuments because the Black community has not been involved in the conversation when we do things like rename parks often. They've come to the table recently and we've been responsive. And I think that we have to look at this as an opportunity to grow as a community and to have difficult conversations about white supremacy, about what it means. But ultimately, there is a statue that causes pain for people who come to work in City Hall every day. You have to walk past that statue to get a marriage license. You have to walk past that statue to get justice. We have a courthouse in City Hall. And I feel very passionately that we have to be responsive to that pain in our community. And that doesn't mean that you dismiss it and that you pretend that it didn't happen. This isn't about sweeping it under the rug, but it is about finding a way to have a really important conversation that goes far beyond just this statue.
Right, and I agree with that. I mean, this statue was created in, was it 1925? You know, black people probably had nothing to say about it. And it also carried forth this whole white supremacy notion, because somebody made the decision this person represented something, you know, really valuable in our city and in the state. And what we're saying is, you know, if you're concerned about white supremacy, that you have to look at that, and community should be involved in making, you know, some decisions around these things. I mean, there are a lot of things that are out there, and we're realists and pragmatists. I mean, you're not going to change everything. You're not going to change Washington Avenue. You're not going to change Lincoln Park, maybe Lincoln Park. But there's so many things that, you know you can't change. But when we get involved in having some of the discussions and understand the extent of white supremacy and all the decisions that we make around statues and other ways that we, glorify people.
Avery, I wanted to get back to your suggestion you wanted to discuss.
Yes, I think that what Mayor Kathy Sheehan was saying about justice, and also a lot of points that Alice Green had about representation and members of the community not being aware of the history. I think that this is an educational moment and we shouldn't squander it. Removing the statue would, like I was saying before, it kind of erases from people's forefront the issues surrounding our nation's founding that perpetuate into modern era. And I think that there is a creative solution to adding to the statue in a way that doesn't infringe upon First Amendment problems with removal and things of that sort. So my idea would be to find an artist who was willing to collaborate with maybe some historians of law and lawyers to see if this had happened in our present 2020 context. How would we prosecute a person for having slaves today? How many years would they go to jail, say? And we could find that out and look at the documents and the evidence that we found concerning Philip Schuyler's enslaved people and work towards a sentencing period. Let's say a lawyer says if this happened in 2020, someone would go to jail for 300 years. Someone would go to jail for 400 years. And find out through the more beautiful aspects of our government and our legal system exactly what Schuyler would go to jail for. And then we could have an artist come and construct a cell and basically have the cell put over him and a plaque saying, Philip Schuyler is here and this is how many years he will have this over him for his crimes. Because I think that's more of a timeless sense of justice, because you're not removing him from the forefront of people's consciousness. I know at the moment that consciousness is uncomfortable. As Mayor Kathy Sheehan was saying, people can't walk by and get a marriage license without seeing it. But I think that we shouldn't squander that centralness, because this is an extremely central part of our history for better and for worse. And removing him, it's taking that out of the forefront. And I think if we really want to work on removing systematic racism, removing this sense of white supremacy. We can't squander these moments of education and these moments to really recontextualize things, and as a community come to terms and reckon what has been done in the past. And I think that that is what hasn't been done with previous movements. And so that's why this is a real opportunity to make a lasting effect without removing anything, without paying for the exorbitant bills it would be to remove it, or putting in a park, which you're then going to, again, have to have someone go and clean and mow the grass and do all of this maintenance. So I think that there is a really thoughtful, provoking way in which to recontextualize the statue that we haven't explored, that when you're driving your car, you would see it. And instead of having people like Ms. Green, who said a lot of members of the community weren't even aware of Schuyler's past, this would be a way in which we could really have the community become aware of the past, because people aren't going to drive by a statue that has a cage around it and not question. I mean, well, that's really provoking.
Well,
and I want perhaps to get to that point. Is there in fact a danger that removing the statue could tend to obscure the debate that we are having now over the statue? In other words, I think it's fair to say that over the course of the last 3 months since the mayor's decision was made, Albany and the greater capital region community has discussed the legacy of the general's slaveholding more than it has at any other point in the 20 years that I've lived here. In other words, the removal of the statue has turned into a kind of locus for thinking about slave owning in our community. And I guess I might pitch that question to Oscar Williams. Is there a chance that by moving the statue, it could in fact be missing an opportunity for bringing that very difficult history of the region in front of our citizens?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I'll admit this has been something that I thought about, because on one hand, yes, the statues are offensive to a certain segment of our population. And certainly no one wants to be constantly reminded of a group's subjugation to slavery. I mean, in fact, I can speak personally. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and grew up all around Confederate statues and streets and highways named after Confederate generals. With that said, I do feel there is a slight danger that if you do remove these statues from out of sight, not necessarily relocate them to another area, but out of sight, that's just one way of just trying to brush, this unspoken history under the rug. Now, that doesn't mean you leave the statues up, but personally, what I would like to see are the statues contextualized in a accurate historical context. As for Schuyler, on one hand, yes, he was a so-called Revolutionary War hero and is celebrated for that. At the same time, he was a slaveholder, something that up until now has been rarely discussed. So I would like to see, if possible, on one hand, yes, having these statues contextualized in a proper manner, in an accurate manner. At the same time, once again, no one should have to be subjugated to being constantly reminded of one's oppression by a statue or a sign or any other type of entity.
We don't need his statue to teach people about history of enslavement.
Okay.
I would rather spend that money helping to rewrite the flawed history that we have in this country and to teach our young people about that period. I would not add also, I mean, I appreciate, Avery, your thoughts and your using your imagination to come up with a solution to this. But you used one that, again, is problematic for Black people. You talk about incarceration. You're only going to put him in a cell. You know, that also prompts a lot of concern when we start talking about all of these things in relationship to, you know, imprisonment and what that means to Black people. And, you know, we can talk about this. And I think the mayor's action has been good in terms of getting us to talk about this issue, but we don't need that statue there to help us to continue that discussion. You know, there are many, many ways of doing that.
I hope that when the statue is gone and the pedestal remains, there can be some great community discussion about what might be erected for that pedestal. We have been so late in this country in recognizing the contributions of people of color to our history and to our culture, fighting against, you know, incredible odds of not even being equal citizens and yet, or judged equal citizens and yet making extraordinary contributions. I'm on a couple of committees that are looking at what neglected Civil War heroes can be placed on the pedestals that are soon to be left empty. In Richmond, for example, Oscar, the Arthur Ashe afterthought at the end of Monument Avenue does not make up for Jefferson Davis and Jeb Stuart and Matthew Fontaine Maury and Leon Jackson. New York City, by the way, we only have 3 women who are portrayed in sculptures in Manhattan, believe it or not. 2 of them are Alice in Wonderland and Mother Goose. One of them is Eleanor Roosevelt in Riverside Park. Central Park is about to install a statue of 3 suffragists, and it took community uproar to include Sojourner Truth in that monument, but she is going to be included in the monument. Shirley Chisholm statue is going to be built in Brooklyn. So I think one of the responses, whatever happens here, is let's build some statues that suggest civic virtue among the people we've neglected in history.
I agree, and I think the mayor's suggestion is very appropriate. That there could be that kind of community discussion where people can weigh in. You know, we've neglected women for so long. We had this discussion when Martin Luther King's statue was put in Lincoln Park. It was designed by a white woman, I think, and the community sort of weighed in on that. It was eventually built, but a lot of people still aren't happy with what she did. But I think it's a perfect opportunity to talk about things like you're suggesting. You know, we've just not done it. You don't see many women statues with all the contributions they've made.
Yes, I'd like to add that also in Richmond, unbeknownst to probably a lot of people, there is actually a Maggie Rena Walker statue of a woman who established a bank and was a generous benefactor in her community in the early 20th century. So.
And in Washington, their rotation is part of the norm. Statuary Hall, which is outrageously populated with, you know, white supremacists and traitors who fought against the Union, there is a reckoning coming, and it's happening as we speak. The state of Florida recently removed a Confederate general, and they're replacing him with Mary McLeod Bethune. So these reappraisals are as natural as, you know, just reappraisals and
Right. But also, there doesn't have to be a statue. I don't know why we're talking.
Well, Statuary Hall, it really does have to be statues.
There are other,
Well,
other
I have
things.
to say, I sort of like the cage idea. I'm not sure Schuyler should be in the cage, but I actually think that's a pretty cool idea. I have to think of telling everybody that it was Avery's idea, but thinking of doing that elsewhere.
Yeah.
Well,
I
and-
love that.
But I think that this is an example of that, we have to think about what was happening on June 11th, right? There was no space for dialogue. And now we're able to engage in this dialogue. And I am committed to ensuring that we continue that conversation. It is not for me to decide where this statue is going to go. It is not for me to decide what is going to replace it. It's for our community to have this conversation and to learn something about one another and our perspectives along the way. And so by doing what I did, it was to try to create the space for us to now have this dialogue that we're having today, and to continue that. And so, that's what I'm committed to. There are some wonderful examples of how this work is being done in other places, and a lot of creative ways of facilitating that conversation. Bringing Avery's idea, into that conversation and really unpacking it, and talking about what that would mean and what that might look like and what alternatives there might be is critically important. And I think that ultimately we come out of it with a better understanding of what it is that we do when we create monuments. And I think it's a cautionary tale about what we do when we create monuments.
You mentioned sort of the context in which the decision was made. Do you think, had it not been for the protests over the death of George Floyd, that of course it came in the wake of so many episodes of police misconduct against people of color, that in a perfect world, that the process would be, the mayor announces, we're going to have a community-wide conversation about what should be done with X statue or monument or what have you. Convene a panel, hearings would be held, and then ultimately there would be good counsel handed up to you, and you would make the ultimate decision. Is that sort of the process?
I think ideally, yes. Ideally, you want to have a community conversation. But sometimes change gets accelerated. And if the end of that conversation, for me, this statute causes pain to people who come to City Hall to work, right? So I'm committed to creating a workplace that reflects the diversity of our city and that is welcoming and supportive of everyone who comes to do their job. And that statue was preventing that from happening. So, but ultimately, right, when leaders make decisions, you need to be engaging with the community to bring along the community with you in that decision-making process. We had talked about last year asking the high school to, in one of their AP classes, have a debate. Every year the AP class does a debate on capitalism versus communism. I thought it would be interesting to have them instead debate what should happen, and how should we be thinking about this Revolutionary War hero in the full context of his life. I still would be interested in where a group of our brilliant high school students would come down on either side of that debate. I think there are a number of ways of engaging in that conversation, but at this point, I have asked a few people. I'm not ready to announce anything yet, but we are going to be having a community conversation led by others, and have the opportunity to, pull from ideas like Avery's about what we do next.
Yeah, I just want to comment on Avery's suggestion or idea, which I'm not dismissing. I don't like the idea of the imprisonment stuff, but we could be talking about how much, I would rather focus on reparations. How much does Schuyler owe us for what the labor that he stole and the impact it's had on Black people? And to me, that would be a much more important kind of discussion to have, because that's where we're headed. At some point, we're going to have to talk about this issue of reparations. It's going to come back again when we're more involved in white supremacy and all of this. That will be the issue that will, I think, force this country to come to terms with what it has done to Black people through white supremacy and enslavement. So I like that idea, but I would sort of add, the or if we place the imprisonment with the reparations.
I have to excuse myself because I'm going off to do something about my new book, but I'm so honored to be on this call with all of you. But since we're talking about women, how about Elizabeth Schuyler? She married an anti-slavery guy, and she's one of the stars of Hamilton, the musical. So we could keep it in the family and celebrate her awakening and her, getting with the program. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for taking part. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Mayor.
Nice meeting you.
Kind of to that point, one of the most interesting things about the sort of immediate aftermath, and it probably goes right to Harold Holzer's point, is that I think I threw it out on social media. Who should replace Philip Schuyler on that pedestal? A couple of suggestions that I saw was the idea of moving Henry Johnson, the decorated World War II hero who was Black, from where he currently sits, a couple of blocks west to in front of City Hall. Mayor, I'm sure you got some more ideas. Oscar Williams, I don't know if you thought any more about that, but who deserves to be in front of City Hall?
Well, one figure that comes to mind for me would be Stephen Myers. And for those who aren't familiar with him, he was a very active conductor of the Underground Railroad in Albany. In fact, Mary and Liz Stewart, who run the Underground Railroad, I can't think of the exact name, but they focus their energies on recreating the history of the Underground Railroad in Albany. So he's certainly one person that comes to mind for me.
I think moving forward as a nation, the power of reconciliation is really the point.
Mayor, did you hear any more suggestions from people as to who might take that place?
We've certainly received a number of emails about this, and I think that again is something that the community has to decide, and I also think that we have to think about what we do with this space. Right, there was not a statue there when City Hall was built. I will say, I look out my window at the back of Philip Schuyler from my office in City Hall, and I see near-death experiences every day. It's a very, very dangerous intersection. The circle itself is just, people trying to cross the street from the Capitol to get over. It's not safe. It would fail every measure of complete streets engineering if we were to bring it to task. So I think we have to have a bigger conversation about sort of what type of space we create there, how we make it safe for everyone, so that if there is another statue that is put in front of City Hall, we can access it in a way that's safe. And that's one of the reasons, when we talk about contextualizing the statue, and a lot of people have said you could put signage up, it's just not safe to even traverse to get to the statue. Because of the decision, there are people who are constantly stopping and taking selfies of themselves in front of the statue. And it's bone chilling to watch, because somebody is going to get hit by a car. So I think we've got to think more broadly about sort of how we think about that public space in front of City Hall.
As a cyclist, I can tell you I take my life in my hands whenever I ride to the top of that hill. Yes.
I agree with the mayor. But you also have to understand that a lot of people who stop there and take their pictures with that statue, they don't know who it is. And that's not just Black people. White people don't know who that is as well, you know. So I think we have to have that discussion. A couple of things that a couple of people that were thrown out to me, and one was to move them and redesign the Martin Luther King statue in Lincoln Park, and also another person that was suggested was John Lewis, who, you know, so those are, but the conversation has to take place. I agree. And I'm not so sure there should be a statue there myself.
Well, I do know that for anything having to do with Schuyler, and we've done stories on it, that the extreme, you know, smash hit popularity of Hamilton has made Albany and the capital region in general, you know, a tourist destination for Hamilton smitten, especially young people. You know, I mean, the Schuyler sisters, if memory serves, Albany Institute of History and Art did a show kind of looking at the legacy of the Schuyler sisters, which of course is very different from the legacy of the Major General. So I think there's that as well. Any other points that anybody would like to raise? We're sort of coming to the end of our allotted time.
Just speaking very quickly, I definitely appreciate having a conversation like this about the Schuyler Statue, because it illuminates more about the legacy of slavery in Albany, let alone in the North. So what I also would hope to come from this would be more of a knowledge about not only about slavery existing in Albany, but just more discussion about those who were enslaved, their lives, stories, also more discussion about particularly resistance against slavery in Albany, let alone New York. So certainly I would like to see more discussion about those who were enslaved.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I agree with you. I think we really have to get across to people that slavery was not a benign event. Because I hear so many people say, well, that was in 1865, it's all over, it's done with, without understanding the impact, not only the people who were enslaved at that particular time, but what it means to us today. We still feel that whole experience of being enslaved. You know, I'm old enough to remember my great grandmother who was born enslaved. And, you know, it wasn't like it was 100 years, a million years ago. You know, we're still feeling that, the effects of it. And as you point out, you know, hopefully we can talk more about the people who were enslaved and what their life was like, and what has happened as a result of that period, and their contributions to this country, which were, you know, a great contribution, but we forget about it.
And Alice, I want to echo that, because you know, this isn't just about the impact that this statue has on Black residents of our city. This country was founded on white supremacy, and we have to be willing to admit that and talk about what that meant and the impact that it continues to have to this day. And until we're ready to engage in that conversation, and I have a lot of people who are outraged by my decision. I have received threats to myself and to my family because of this decision. It strikes a very difficult chord for many Americans, and they don't want to engage or admit the brutality that was slavery and the impact that it continues to have to this day. And so I think that it's critically important that we continue to move forward, have this conversation, and create the more perfect union that was imagined, but that left out a whole group of people, including women. And I think that what I'm encouraged by is that we are having those difficult conversations, and we can't scream at each other about it. We have to be honest about our history. And I think that's one of the things that this entire conversation around this statue has helped to happen here in the city of Albany.
Avery, any final thoughts?
Yes, I think that for my generation and the future, in order to become a more perfect nation, we need to use the power of reconciliation. I don't know that retribution is going to be something that would be possible. You can never claim back that time, those people, those souls. And so I think it's about enacting the voices of those who have been silenced in the canon for so long in history and moving forward. For young people, I think it's about reconciliation and discussion and education and ending systematic racism, ending white supremacy. But whilst we're doing it, joining forces and having discussion.
Reparations is possible, if that's what you we don't like to think about it, but it's possible.
That is a conversation that could go on for several days at least. So I would like to thank all of you for taking part. My goal for this was to have a conversation that would involve people talking to each other as opposed to past one another. And I really think we have accomplished that. These are fraught conversations, but I thank you for taking the time and giving us your wisdom. Mayor Kathy Sheehan, Alice Green, Professor Oscar Williams, Harold Holzer, and Avery Schuyler-Dey, thank you so much for taking part, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who listened in. We very much appreciate it. I'm Casey Schuyler for the Times-Union. Please have a good day yourselves.